So I just wanted to share a story today about a real estate transaction I was working on that fell through. And it reminded me of how in my mind I set up this kind of business rule of how I would acquire wealth, and that this particular transaction at this stage in my wealth building journey kind of violated my own business rule. And so I did a lot of thinking about it, and I decided to kind of do this driving thoughts recording and podcast about what I think are the 3 tracks for building wealth. And I think you can kind of break these methods down in the different ways you try to build wealth, regardless of the asset categories, whether it's real estate, lending, business, e-commerce. There are 3 ways to go about it, and I call it the 3 tracks for building wealth. And one of those tracks for building wealth is what I call doing it from scratch. The second track is rehabbing, and the third track is buying existing cash flow. So I want to start with doing it from scratch. And what I mean by doing it from scratch is you find a piece of land and you decide to build a rental or an income producing property on that land. Or you try to start a business from scratch. Like you decide you want to own a coffee shop, or you want to own a bank or a hair salon. And so you go out, you find an empty building that didn't have that type of business in it, and you're going to spend all kinds of money to build out that real estate and make it work for that business, and then have to brand and market that business, develop a new customer database, and completely start from scratch. And I've done that a few times, and I think it's the most risky, the most time-consuming, the most expensive, and the most stressful way to try to build wealth. And I'm not saying, hey, don't do it from scratch. Facebook was an idea, and it started from scratch, and now it's worth billions. So I'm not saying don't do it that way, but there's a better way, especially when you're first starting out trying to build wealth. And starting from scratch is not the best way. Like I said, it takes a lot more capital. Up front, you incur more debt. It's more challenging to borrow money because you have no collateral in place. There's no income the bank can look at. You're reaching in your pocket more before and after startup. So it's just super risky and very expensive. I started this whole, next level mastermind and job for the economy platform where I want to educate people on building wealth. I'm starting this from scratch, and I've been, a few years into it. It's going well, but it's challenging. I could have become a certified coach with Bob Proctor. I could have went to Dave Ramsey and become a certified financial coach. And then, they help you get clients. They give you the websites, the tools. You have a brand right out of the box. So there's all these different ways to start from scratch that are better, and I would recommend that you franchise. So rather than starting a burger restaurant yourself, maybe go start a McDonald's, because McDonald's has like almost 0 failure rate, okay? So franchising, if you're going to start from scratch, is a great way to significantly reduce the chances of failure. Even my own brokerage company, Joe Herbert Realty, I didn't go out and buy a franchise like Coldwell Banker or Keller Williams or Remax. I just started as an independent, no franchise, and I'm 5 years into this, and it's been very challenging. I'm working my tail off, okay? I started a nightclub from scratch with my business partners. We went and bought this old warehouse. It couldn't have been more of a worse choice for a nightclub because it didn't meet any of the code requirements. It didn't meet occupancy. It didn't meet zoning. And we spent almost $1 million trying to make it happen. And it broke our business relationship, quite frankly, and the deal eventually failed. So if you're already trying to build wealth, or you want to build wealth, don't do it from scratch, okay? It's just too risky. The second choice is rehabbing. That's where you find a business and maybe it's not doing that well. Maybe it did well in the past and the facility needs to really be cleaned up and they need a new menu or new services or a new staff and new marketing. At least the infrastructure is in place, okay? You've already got a location. The public may already know that that business is located there, and now you're just trying to make it better, okay? That's less risky than starting from scratch. Typically, there is some cash flow in place, hopefully. There is some collateral there. There is some, tax returns you can look at if it's a business. You can, if it's a building, you can look at it. Let's say it's going to be an income property. Maybe there are a few tenants there, or hopefully it doesn't need too much work to get tenants in it. And actually, this building that I mentioned that made me do this podcast that I just terminated the agreement on, it was empty. It had been empty for decades. It was a 12-unit building. But after I put it under agreement and got through all my due diligence, it was just a complete disaster. And I just realized I was going to have to put way more money in it than I thought. And so I terminated the agreement. It was just too risky. And again, I'm sitting there after I terminate and thinking, why am I doing this? I should be using the buy existing method, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But, even my real estate building or where my real estate brokerage is, I bought this old schoolhouse. I put $100,000 in it over the course of 2 years. And instead, I could have been using that $100,000 to brand and market my business. I should have just went out and rented some office space and focused on getting the business up and running. But I saddled my startup with this old schoolhouse that needed a ton of money put in it. So, I was in the rehab business. I wasn't in the business startup business. I bought an Airbnb house, and it wasn't an Airbnb house. It was a big house. I knew it would be a good Airbnb. And instead of buying an existing Airbnb that was already running, I turned this place into one. Well, I spent 30 or 40 grand over 8 months before I had any revenue coming in because it had to be really reworked to make it a great Airbnb. So lesson learned. The next time I do another Airbnb, I'm going to find one that's for sale and I'm going to buy it. So I'm getting to the best method here to build wealth, and that's this third choice where you buy existing. Okay, buy rental properties that already have tenants in them. I call it buying leases because that's what you're really doing. It's not about buying that physical multi-tenant building. You're buying those leases, and the day you get the keys and the deed at closing, you're cash flowing, okay? It's cash flow at closing. That is without a doubt the best way to do it. I sold a coffee shop to a guy. It was up and running. The building was in great shape. The business had great cash flow. There was a great staff in place. The day he closed on that, he had a coffee shop that was running great. Everybody knew about it. It had great sit-down business, great drive-through business. I've bought in the past few years, I've probably bought 3 very nice rental properties that were all fully rented, had great tenants in it, and again, I was cash flowing right at closing. So I don't know why I was trying to buy this other building here that I just terminated because it went against my policy of cash flow at closing. That's how you build wealth. The number one real estate investor in my town, he has more units than anybody else, and that's where I got this whole buy leases, cash flow at closing concept. I've really watched this guy build tremendous wealth, especially in the last 5 or 6 years. He's exploded. And he's done it by buying leases. He's done it by cash flowing at closing. And if you think about this, if you study all the most successful, wealthiest people, or the companies that have grown the most and they're worth billions, most of them, they build wealth through acquisition of existing cash flow, okay? Dr. Dre started that Beats headphones company. Apple bought that company for, I think, $2 billion. Amazon and Facebook all grow through acquiring other companies. They're always buying other companies. Coca-Cola and the big food producer companies buy up all these smaller companies once they get up and running and they're successful. In fact, starting a company and selling it to a bigger company is a great way to build wealth. If you can start a company that becomes successful in a certain sector, and then a big company wants to buy you. When I was an engineer, I worked for a company, and they had 50% of their market share, and their biggest competitor had 50%, the other 50%, and they knew they weren't going to grow by trying to get that other 50% away from their competitor. So they decided they were going to go from 50 million to 250 million by acquiring other companies that they had the expertise to run. They were in similar sectors, but they had the expertise to run them. And that's what they did. They went about buying these $5 to $50 million companies to increase their net worth and their portfolio. And then they bought these companies that were already cash flowing, already had the right people in place running the companies. And so that is the number one way to build wealth, is by existing. And another reason why is because these assets are already making money, banks want a loan on them. So they're great collateral. The banks can look at the tax returns and verify that they're already cash flowing. They can do appraisals on the buildings if these are businesses and buildings. So it's easier to get money. There's no startup costs except for if you have to make a down payment on a bank loan. Again, the collateral's great. There's existing income. The day you take over ownership, you are building wealth on day one. There's no better way to do it. So again, the most successful people and the most successful companies build wealth through acquisition of existing cash flow. So if you want to start out and you want to become wealthy, find things that are already making money and buy those assets. That's the best way to do it. Buy notes that are already in place. Buy businesses that are already running. Buy real estate that already has tenants and leases. Okay? So the moral of that story is, there's 3 tracks for building wealth. There's start from scratch, there's rehab, and there's buy existing. And you want to buy existing cash flow. Buy leases, buy cash flow, and you will become wealthy.